Good morning, afternoon, and evening, people of the interwebs. This is yet another stirring episode of the Hardline According to Stonefruit. This time I'm flying solo to tell you that conspiracy theories are real. There wouldn't be laws against them if they didn't exist. But there are laws against them because they do exist. Conspire to breathe together. Here's the straw man argument you usually hear. Are you trying to tell me that there's some small group of people in some dark and smoky room that plot and scheme to come up with some ironclad plans to rule the world and manipulate every aspect of social reality, somehow implement them seamlessly? There are loci of control, centers of control, where they establish consensus and calibrate their rhetoric, like the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which was just held very recently, and the Bilderberg Group, uber powerful, and the Council on Foreign Relations, the think tank among think tanks of the Beltway Consensus. But more importantly, they all went to the same schools, they have similar backgrounds and institutional positions and outlooks on life. They recognize their class interests and act on them, and so on and so on. So when you go to the same schools and universities and you produce content for and consume the same media and go to the same agenda setting conferences, of course they're going to have a kind of groupthink. And that's where conspiracy theories are focusing their fire. So these types of people at the apex, from a young age and throughout the rest of their lives, they were and continue to be indoctrinated into similar sets of ideologies. They know which cues to follow and give out to rise up the ladder of careerism, but not all conspiracy theories are true. And the inane ones are often lumped in together with the highly plausible ones to discredit them all in mass. For some, there's too little information to make a determination. For others, there's a preponderance of evidence. For still others, there are receipts. I'm talking about signed memoranda in America Freedom of Information Act requests, data, declassified documents, and all of these sources are smoking guns. Like, for example, Operation Northwoods, right before the Bay of Pigs, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent JFK a memo saying, let's blow up some civilian airliners and blame it on Cuba. Same with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Investigative journalism, scholarly books, they're out there. There's even a conspiracy theory about the term conspiracy theory. It originated with the CIA to denigrate anyone who didn't agree with the findings of the Warren Commission on the CIA's on the JFK assassination. Anyone who didn't believe in the Warren Commission's report on it. This is the same Warren Commission that had Allen Dulles as a pivotal member. Immediately prior, Dulles was head of the CIA when JFK said that he wanted to smash it into 1,000 pieces and cast it to the wind. And RFK Jr. has spoken at length about how the intelligence community and the CIA had a long-standing war against his family. So, the pervasive stereotype in popular culture of a conspiracy theorist is of a paranoid, hypervigilant figure synthesizing epic amount of signs and symbols to draw up really idiosyncratic indictments and arraignments of shadowy forces directing world affairs from behind the scenes. This is obviously a caricature. It's a hard driven, eccentric loner, typically, battling the unseen, wielding only the weapon of information. It's been expressed in a variety of movies, television programs, and books. The crazed eyes, the verbal diarrhea, the pressure to talk, the immense wall of post it notes behind them connected with miles of yarn connecting post its on a giant wall. Paradigmatic examples include my first exposure to the figure in Richard Linklater's groundbreaking independent movie Slacker, which had a JFK assassination researcher in it who wouldn't stop buttonholing a female character in a bookstore in Austin. And incidentally, my uncle was a friend of Linklater's, and I actually met him to interview to be the head of the Austin Film Society when I was in Austin trying to break into indie film. And I not only didn't bring up my Uncle Marcus's friendship with him, but I misspelled his name, Linklater, as Linkletter, in my thanks for the interview note. And that's one of those regrets that still haunts me to this day, and part of why I never achieved the success as any type of independent filmmaker today. But Richard Donner also made the movie starring Mel Gibson, Conspiracy Theory, and Thomas Pynchon and Don DeLillo, as if people still have novels with conspiracy theorists in there. There's the Fox Mulder character in the TV show that was popular years ago, X-Files. And these all brought the figure into the mainstream, especially in the broad overlap between conspiracy theory and ufology. And the X-Files had a motto, two mottos: the trust no one and the truth is out there, which show you this epistemic double bind that a lot of conspiracy theorists supposedly find themselves in. And in spite of the ridicule, I embrace the term. I think of it like Queer Nation, the activist group at the beginning of the AIDS pandemic in the throughout the 1980s. And they took the term queer and called their group Queer Nation. And what was a very derogatory term is now a mainstream source of power for that gender identity, LGBTQI+. So I'm not afraid of the term. I welcome it. But contemporary America still has a schizophrenic attitude towards conspiracy theory. On the one hand, it is a default attitude of skepticism of the general population, perhaps a bit commodified towards history and especially government, especially since Watergate in the 60s. And with the collapse of the reassuring dualities of the Cold War, sometimes conspiracy theory becomes an all-embracing, all-encompassing teleology. And we'd have to say that QAnon is an excellent case in point in recent years. But in spite of the tremendous energy that exponents of the conventional wisdom and consensus reality put into ridiculing, denigrating, and marginalizing conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theory as a mode of social, political, historical analysis, such ideas have enough resonance among the general population that it's a major cottage industry. And a lot of these entrepreneurs have very savvy cross promotion with online platforms, videos, somewhat related products, talks. They're often can make a living at being conspiracy theories, like Alex Jones. And of course, he's gone way too far on a number of occasions, but he's certainly right a plurality of times, maybe even more often than not. On the other hand, the disavowal of conspiracy theory has also become an integral part of the conventional wisdom itself, a social technology of control that establishes the boundaries of quote-unquote responsible discourse by reflecting elite consensus on the fundamental nature of social reality itself, but in accordance with the elite's own class interests. This makes for an incredibly effective means of social control by establishing ruling class hegemony and controlling dissent, foreclosing alternatives, engineering support, and transmuting their ruling class self-interests into those of the nation state as a whole, even though their ruling class has little to no allegiance to any nation state whatsoever. And sometimes, too, the elites often create their own fact-free conspiracy theories. And a great example is Russiagate, a fine case in point, which emanates from a camp that is sometimes called Blue Anon or shit libs. The right wing likes to call the so-called left wing libtards, but that just shows that they have no understanding of the nuances of the left. I hate to even put the Democratic Party in the left. We're not libtards, right-wingers. The people you're referring to are shit libs. That's CNN, MSNBC, and their ilk. So conspiracy theories and their leitmotifs are varied, sometimes contradictory. A good example would be how the perennial bête noire of conspiracy theorists, the Council on Foreign Relations, is characterized. In the 60s, when conspiracy theory was more of the associated with the right wing and the John Bircher types, they saw CFR as a high cabal of godless commies ushering in a world socialist government led by the United Nations. And then when the left took its crack at them, we saw it as a different type of high cabal steering America into transnational corporate imperialism. And comparably, conspiracy theorists also have a wide variety of attitudes towards their material. Some exercise the detached, self-reflexive irony of the Fox Mulder character in X-Files, and ufologists in particular push this irony well into high camp and view pilgrimages to Roswell, New Mexico, or Area 51 as a whimsical affinity group allegiance and bonding instead of an act of true discovery. Some even organize their lives around the identity of conspiracy theorists and, of course, exhibit all of the tedious features and characteristics of any true believer in any zealot cult. Some exhibit, however, the dispassionate rigor of social scientists, as I would like to think I do as a holder of a PhD and a published sociologist and historian of education. And one of my two masters was in English, and the English department had a concentration in cultural studies. Cultural studies never knows where to fit in to the academy, so it's usually stuffed in the English department. And it was at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, when I got one of my two masters, and well, where I got both of my masters and my PhD. And my thesis for my English master's with a concentration of cultural studies was a look at the social construction of conspiracy theories in post-industrial representative democracies like America. And the academic literature, which I pretty much read all of it up till 2003, 2004, was that with the collapse of the Cold War and its comforting dualisms, that a fragmented and insecure and economically collapsing general populace was ferreting about for any means of establishing a sense of control and understanding over a tumultuous social world. And that's all. It was never given any legitimation or any sense of explanatory power. That was the only thesis that could get you a peer-reviewed article or an academically published book on conspiracy theory. And I also read most of the popular literature up to that point as well. So, okay, that was pushing 20 years ago, but I'm pretty well read in conspiracy theory from an academic and a popular perspective. But one is apt to be labeled a conspiracy theorist for even thinking that a ruling class exists or that it seeks to maintain hegemony, to say nothing of the idea that the ruling class often uses conspiratorial methods to perpetuate its own enrichment and ongoing control and survival. But they do. And that's why we have laws against conspiracy theory. And that's why it sparks such a poignant reaction among the general population, because they intuitively sense that there's something not only compelling about it, but something that explains social reality in a way that's it's a lot more and different than just the comfort that the academic analysis of conspiracy theory purports to explain away. So, even though the working class hasn't exercised its class interests, I would say, not since the death of labor action in the 40s, and maybe not since even the 30s, when social forces and extra parliamentary pressure, not electoral politics, brought us the New Deal. Back when America had powerful socialist parties, communist parties, social movements, mass movements, then the working class exercised its class interests in a powerful and sustained way, in a mass way. And since then, with the collapse of union activism and social movements, it doesn't. But the ruling class recognizes its class interests and acts on them over and over and over and over and over again. So, rather than conspiracy theory, most media and intellectual gatekeepers prefer to view elite behavior through the lenses of somnambulist theory, that history occurs as a sleepwalker walks through the night. Coincidence theory, it's all just a coincidence, it all just happens. incompetence theory, especially government. Oh, they can't never ever do anything right. Or spontaneity theory, it really just happens. So they'll just exercise no amount of intellectual gymnastics to suggest that the rich and powerful, like the rest of us in our personal lives, if not as a class, act to support our perceived best interests, or that ruling class acts to maintain its perceived self-interest, in spite of a massive sociological literature on elite deviance and the power elite, and laws against conspiracy. But true freedom of mind requires not only the negative absence of constraint, but also the positive presence of other alternatives. Even though the rich and powerful have repeatedly used conspiracy to get richer and more powerful, to mention this sociological fact immediately draws the most vicious criticism, including charges of superstition, cynicism, paranoia, hysteria, and primitivism. I saw this again and again in the academic literature. Conspiranoia can and should be a tool of empirical explanation. It is possible to point fingers and name names. These scum fuckers have names and addresses. The powers that be, thousands of people on a planet of billions, with the 0.00001% of the uber rich and their lackeys and technocrats making up the rest of 1%, operate not quite in conspiracy, but in tacit collusion, supporting an agenda of domination fostered by the similarity of their backgrounds, calibrated at key forums and through key organizations. However, ultimately, the appeal of conspiracy theory plus paranoia, aka conspiranoia, is that of narrative itself. Narrative's ability to predict, control, and explain, and entertain. Although conspiracy theory offers the aficionado an integrated worldview, which is what academic literature says that it's all that it does, it also provides more than that. When confronted with the potential evidence of conspiracy theory, a person has to ask what they do in criminal trials. Is there motive, means, and opportunity? All too often, there is. Especially at the intersection of politics, law, high finance, quote-unquote intelligence, diplomacy, covert military action, narco-trafficking, organized crime, and the media simulacrosphere. Simulacrum is a term I'm borrowing from Baudrillard, the great social thinker, which is basically an endless proliferation of copies for which there is no original. And that's how I see mainstream media today, on and offline. But when you combine all of those sectors, you have the deep state. During the Trump administration, the deep state was used to refer to the bureaucracy, typically, the national security state, the national security blob that existed before presidencies and administrations and will exist after them, and has its own institutional priorities and prerogatives. That is certainly one way to conceptualize the deep state, but I think to take it one level deeper, we need to look at where those sectors that I just mentioned all overlap in a giant Venn diagram of sordid, filthy, money grubbing, power grasping. Life writing can be an effective means of examining this nexus because, as was written about Lee Harvey Oswald, who was not the lone gunman, biography, human conspiracy originates in a preconception of the person as a historical agent. And you can see a companion piece to this video at stonefruit.substack.com, where for the last year and a half, all the video podcasting I have been doing is accompanied by articles there. So instead of the usual characterization of conspiracy theory as a very individualized and purely psychological pathology, conspiracy theory can be better thought of as a populist fusion of life writing, historiography, and political science. Now that's populism as it originated in the 1890s in Kansas, in the United States, as a political force, a political party, but also a political philosophy that is the people against the rich and powerful, which is the fight we have now. The bottom against the top, not the right against the left. That is not the fight. The fight is the people, the bottom against the top. And that's why to continue to foist upon us the false fight of left versus right, the contemporary definition of populism in media and academia is of authoritarian demagogues like Orbán's, the leader in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China. Less so him, but in general, if you're an authoritarian against a lot of the international multilateral institutions that subordinate nation states to their control, that's who are called populists now. As we need to rescue the phrase conspiracy theory and take its power back and redefine its meaning, so too I believe we should take back the power of the word populism. And from a populist frame of reference, conspiracy theory combines life writing, historiography, and political science to create explanatory narratives that contradict the elite consensus on history, social reality, and what I believe it was John Maynard Keynes called the conventional wisdom. Maybe it was Galbraith. So it's a major development in the long tradition of popular resistance to state power and economic oligarchy. Not of the right versus the left, but of the bottom versus the top. So at its best, conspiracy theory is a radical exercise of the skepticism and critical reason at the heart of the Enlightenment itself. In this sense, it represents what is probably a last-ditch effort among the final efforts by the supposed repositories of popular sovereignty, the people, to save small l liberal humanism itself from its demented doppelganger, the elite program of omnicidal devastation of every natural system in the world that made organized human civilization possible. the enslavement of the supposedly autonomous bourgeois subject, so vital to the Enlightenment project, under regimes of panoptic control managed by technocrats serving the super rich, using all of the awesomely powerful tools made possible by the nation state and what have been called the fourth and fifth industrial revolutions, the explosion of technology, particularly in the last 20, 25, 30 years, and the devouring of the surplus value created by the working and middle classes. This is their elite plan, to manufacture perpetual war for perpetual peace, and to create artificial scarcity to rob us of our natural ecstasy and the bountiful leisure time that we could have had but now cannot have and never will have, because we are in the midst of a slow, irreversible, terminal collapse of large-scale human society. Conspiracy narratives, the ones that are correct anyway, can be empirical explanations of social reality, since it can easily be argued that, quote, conspiracy is the normal continuation of normal politics by normal means. And where there is no limit to power, there is no limit to conspiracy. Carl Oglesby in The Yankee versus the Cowboy, a pioneering text of conspiranoia. So the knee-jerk denigration of these types of attitudes by the mainstream demonstrate that their disavowal has become a vital tool of social control in peak Anthropocene. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, virtually all of the pre- and anti-capitalist systems have been colonized by international finance capital, by monetocracy, by a transnational corporate socialism that socializes the costs but privatizes the profits. This is kleptocracy by any other name, albeit a far more sophisticated one than that practiced by such kleptocratic dictators as Ferdinand Marcos, Baby Doc Duvalier, and Mobutu in Zaire and their ilk. Although seemingly at its moment of universal triumph, this system has been teetering on the brink of economic, political, and social collapse for decades, which is ushering in a technotronic softcore totalitarianism in core states like the G7, mediated by big tech, finance capital, and so-called intelligence. Zbigniew Brzezinski's Technotronic Age, as important for its time in the 70s as his grand tech chessboard was later. It is precisely the dramatically escalating accumulation of these contradictions within the global capitalist system that somnambulist theorists, coincidence theorists, incompetence theorists, and coincidence theorists use to try to deflect public opinion away with their vilification of conspiracy theories. The power elite deliberately obscure the structural limitations on free will that they themselves have largely created, to mask the sad fact that, as human civilization has evolved from feudalism to democracy. We have traded kings and czars for presidents and prime ministers, but the money power behind the scenes has remained the same. Worse yet, it has allowed only the absolute minimum concessions necessary to stave off social revolution. Mere hints at sane economic, political, and legal orders, which are being ruthlessly and systematically destroyed and rolled back in every way possible, wherever, whenever they can, with all deliberate speed. The regime of capital accumulation survives by feeding off of the subject body while stupefying the subject mind with the myth of individual agency and doing everything in the regime's power to ensure that this agency cannot be used in any meaningful way. In such an environment, ridiculing, denigrating, and marginalizing conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists becomes a mean of cordoning off from the masses the fact that they are being lied to each and every day of their lives by authority figures that they're supposed to trust, by the consumerist hydrocarbon-based post-industrial civilization that they think is giving them the wonderful lives that they lead, but which in reality is psychopathic and terminal. And there's no mechanism for it to ever improve until a slow series of convulsive collapses occur. So the government hires the politicians to do the lying. They do it in service of a permanent government. Politicians are just the provisional government. This permanent government, above and behind political power, is a secular oligarchy working in tacit collusion, not quite conspiracy. In America, they are the great commercial dynasties, the Fortune 500 companies and their lobbyists, the media simulacra sphere, the civil and military services, the large research universities and law firms and charitable foundations. They hire the politicians. They establish the boundaries of the politicians' agendas. They authorize the production of elections, which at this point are nothing more than meaningless pageants whose only utility is to preserve the brand name of representative democracy. So while only 20% of Americans in this supposed beacon of representative democracy like what their government is doing for them in their name, 90% of the supposedly authoritarian, profoundly anti-democratic China approve of theirs. The power elite in the so-called Western democracies are able to convince a large enough portion of the general population that the system still works by means of these pageants, so that the machinery of the real work, the oppression, the theft, the enslavement, the surveillance, the narrative control, and the murder can continue to operate without friction. There are camps within this oligarchy, and they make effective use of organizations like the ones I've mentioned, the World Economic Forum in Davos, the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so many other organizations to calibrate their rhetoric, achieve consensus, and even set policy that supersedes that of supposedly sovereign countries. Look at all of the trade agreements, which are really investor protection agreements. This isn't done in smoky star chambers. It's done in the miasmic groupthink of those with similar backgrounds, class interests, institutional positions, all pursuing the interests of the global capitalist system by pursuing extremely misguided senses of their own self-interest. Because by pursuing what they perceive as their own self-interest, they will destroy everything, as a parasite can kill its host, or a cancer. As the key nations of transnational corporate imperialism, the key states degenerate into soft-core police states, they are slowly stripping citizens of their rights that the citizens still think they have. They will periodically manufacture incidents and crises like 9/11, which created the new forever enemy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as excuses for increased governmental power. And now, supposedly, international jihad is falling off of the radar as the forever enemy. It had a good run. It lasted 20 years. But now it seems to be the desire of America and its vassal states to fight Russia and China simultaneously as the new enemy. And in academia and international relations, if you know an idea's got an acronym, it's probably a bad sign that is a real consolidation of groupthink. And I believe the acronym is GPC, for Great Power Conflict, in IR, International Relations. And that's basically American political and economic and academic elites, not Americans, thinking that the next great fight is against Russia and China. And they're right in a way, but not the way that they think, and they're certainly going to lose. But Russia, China as the dyad, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and so many countries like Argentina and Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and many others are poised to join, is the next ring out. And then the next ring out are the over 144 countries that China has already signed agreements with for the Belt and Road Initiative that not only links all of Eurasia, but Africa and South America as well, with China and East Asia. Corridors of high-speed rail and gas and oil pipelines and communication lines. And this is why America blew up Nord Stream pipelines, delivering cheap gas from Russia to Germany and the rest of Europe, which allowed Germany to be an industrial and exporting powerhouse. Because the whole NATO and beyond NATO, the Atlanticist program in general, had as one of its central features a obsessive desire to prevent any closer union between German capital and technology and high-skilled labor with Russian commodities, because that would foster a much closer integration of NATO, of Europe, particularly Western Europe, who are now clearly vassal states of America and no longer even allies, with the rest of Eurasia. And Condoleezza Rice said it about 8 years ago that we need to, at all costs, prevent that union between Soviet Union, between Russia and Germany. And then, of course, Biden had his moment where he said, if Russia puts tanks into Ukraine, we're going to end Nord Stream. And a reporter asked, how are you going to do it? And this is a Russian and German project. And he said, we have our ways. So Condoleezza Rice's statement, motive, Biden's statement, means, and NATO held war games in the Baltic right before Nord Stream was blown up, right over the island of, I believe it's called Bomholm, which is a Danish island just south of mainland Sweden. And some vessels were retained in the Black Sea, or not Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea. During that time, after the exercises were done, and the theme of the exercise was to demine mines undersea using unmanned underwater vehicles. Exactly the type of exercise that would allow placement of an explosion on Nord Stream. Motive, means, and opportunity. And in a recent testimony before Congress, Valerie Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, who's now a honcho at the State Department, number 2 or 3, according to the organizational chart, but maybe exercising greater power than Secretary of State, particularly in European affairs. But I digest. So, although conspiracy theorists exist in a heterodox variety, many of them do share a belief in the rough outline of a dystopian nightmare. If true, it is the truth which cannot be spoken. For that reason, media and academic gatekeepers will continue to dismiss anything that challenges the conventional wisdom and consensus reality as a conspiracy theory, until some catalyst or number of catalysts finally reveal enough of the horrible truth to enough of the people to facilitate a paradigm shift of world historical importance. The ills of society can neither be ameliorated nor even adequately described or understood by means of law and culture alone. Nevertheless, efforts to ameliorate these laws cannot succeed without significant and committed work in the legal field and world of culture and art and ideas. However, such work is necessarily defensive in posture until such time as a significant, substantial pressure is brought to bear on the system outside of the political process, either through, this is a quote from Cornel West back in the day, quote, grassroots citizens' participation in credible progressive projects or rebellious acts of desperation that threaten the social order. It seems to me we have come to a moment where the great dean of conspiranoia, Robert Anton Wilson, said, well, we can get to what he said in a moment. With adequate reach into a broad enough segment of the general population by leaking past the media oligarchy and the prestige pyramid of the Ivy League and its peer institutions, armed with an adequate credibility, by weeding itself of the pervasive disinformation that so often taints it, conspiracy theory has a role to play. It has the potential to precipitate and consolidate a significant portion of the prerequisite pressure outside of the political process, which at this day and age is a shuck and jive game, a fool's errand. So, as Robert Anton Wilson said, the dean of the American conspiracy theory culture, like it or not, the people of the fringe are in an apocalyptical struggle. Either the elite technicians of control will be able to perfect their techniques to the level where dissent can be abolished, or heretics will mutate to some level of consciousness where they can do holy and miraculous things to resurrect the old dream of freedom for all. End quote. To save the Enlightenment, to save the Enlightenment, to save liberal humanism, to put an end to the omnicidal destruction. This may seem like a millennial hope. It may also prove to be a cogent and empirically sound prediction made at a decisive historical crossroads. In any event, until consciousness is liberated to such a degree as to enable the establishment of an abiding regime of peace, non-woke social justice, and ungreenwashed environmental sustainability. As Rousseau said so long ago, one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. This has been Stonefruit with yet another stirring edition of the Hardline According to Stonefruit.